What's a bit about penguins? Today we do 2022, number 5, community ecology and invasive species. The following models represent all the interacting species in two different communities with some of the same species and feeding relationships. These models assume that both communities have the same initial biomass. The models can be used to understand the effects of human activities on the communities. So here we can see community A and community B, and they also have labeled our tertiary consumers, our secondary consumers, our primary consumers, and our primary producers. Notice that they've given them symbols for those, so you can still use those same symbols when you write your FRQ. You can shorthand it TC, SC, PC, and PP as a way to kind of allow the reader to know which level you're describing. So A asks us to describe a community or characteristic of a community that makes a species invasive in that community, but not invasive in a different community. So since we've been given two different communities, they want to say, okay, how can one species be invasive here, but not invasive here? Okay, so two different communities. Well, it has to do with the natural predators. So if there's no natural predators, if there's no competition and there's no diseases, then you're going to find that a species is going to be invasive in one community. But if the other community does have that predator, or does have that competition, or does have the disease, is going to then, of course, allow it to be susceptible for us to, invasiveness. Okay. So a student says the community not having a natural predator or worse competition allows the species to become invasive as they're able to grow and thrive in their new environment. However, if the community has a natural predator or there's other species more suited to the environment than the invasive species, then it can't be invasive because it isn't taking over the ecosystem with its growth and expansion. Part B asks us to explain why removing PP1 will have a greater effect on community B than community A. So if we look here and we say, okay, well, let's get rid of PP1, then what is going to consume PP1? Well, community 1A, we see PC1 and PC2 are consuming it. But in community B, we see only PC2 consumes it. So we kind of follow that PC2 for a second. And so you notice that if we lose PP1 in community B, that means there's no food for PC2, which means there's less food for SC2, and then there's, of course, less food for TC2. So we're going to see a decrease in all those organisms. Versus over here, when we have the decrease of PP1, like it's gone, PC2 still has another food source. It can still eat PP2, which means we're not going to see that decrease or as much of the PC2, which is not going to affect those higher feeding relationships. So you had to mention either in community B that there was a decrease in PC2, SC2, TC2. Notice this underline right here. That means that all of those statements had to be given if you were using this bullet point. And then you would say that in community A, PC2 has alternative food sources. You could talk about that there would be less primary producers and that led for less path for energy to move through that community. You could also talk about how this would allow community C to actually be less resilient in future environmental change because of the fact that they are missing that PP1. So a student says PP1 for community B would mean that PC2 would have no food, essentially killing it off. This would lead to SC2 only having half of its food available, making its population drop, and consequently TC2's as well. However, such glaring changes wouldn't occur in community A because only PC1 solely depends on PP1. PC2 still can eat PP2, and SC1 could then only eat PC2. With multiple sources of food, the loss of PP1 would have a much smaller impact on community A. So part C, an invasive species, INV, that eats individuals of species SC2 is introduced in community B. Using the template in the space provided for your response for community B, indicate the feeding relationship for this invasive species by correctly placing INV to represent the invasive species and an arrow to represent the feeding relationship within community B. So we need to figure out, okay, where are we going to place INV? Okay, well, we know that it is going to consume SC2. So here's SC2, and here's, of course, TC2, which consumes SC2. So we're going to make it equal, kind of, so it'll be at that tertiary consumer level, and the arrow will be, of course, going to it to denote that the INV is consuming SC2. Okay, so here's the student's response. They, of course, placed it there, and we are good to go. Remember that this is a question 5, which means you're going to be modifying your diagram in some way. So this would be the modification that you had to make on the 2022 exam. Part D says, explain how human activities that add toxins to the soil could change a community with many species at each trophic level, such as community A, into a community with few species at each trophic level, such as community B. So they're asking, how can community A basically transform and be like community B due to those toxins? Well, if there's toxins in the soil, that means that those primary producers are going to have those toxins. And if the primary producers have the toxins, then the primary consumers consuming those primary producers are going to have a buildup of that toxin. And the secondary consumers, of course, consume our primary consumers. So they'll have that buildup of that toxin. So we see the biomagnification moving its way up. As we get those higher levels, there's too much of those toxins, which could cause those higher trophic level organisms, which could cause the decrease in our diversity within our community. Okay. You could also talk about that there would be less that primary producer, which then also leads to that reduction in our species diversity at those higher trophic levels. So, a student says human activities that add toxins to the soil would kill many plants which are primary producers. Less primary producers would lead to less food for primary consumers, making their population numbers drop. There would then be less primary consumers for secondary consumers to eat, leading their population numbers to drop. With less resources, many species of each trophic level would compete more. This would likely lead to many species being outcompeted to the point where they go extinct and migrate away from the community. Thus, each trophic level would have less species. So, hope that was helpful. Remember, 85 penguins are just as best. Bye, y'all.